You're seriously not contributing to the gift? Wow, Emma. I knew you were cheap, but this is a new low even for you. My brother's voice carried across the backyard, cutting through the laughter and conversation like a knife through silk, and suddenly every eye at the family barbecue was fixed on me with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moment hung suspended in the warm June afternoon, the smell of grilled burgers mixing with my rising mortification as I stood there holding a plate of potato salad I had brought, feeling the weight of 40 pairs of eyes evaluating me, calculating whether my brother's public accusation had merit. The sunshine that had felt pleasant moments before now seemed harsh and exposing, illuminating me like a spotlight on a stage I had never asked to occupy. My name is Emma Catherine Morrison. I am 29 years old, and I work as a financial advisor for a respected wealth management firm in Seattle, Washington. I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Washington with a degree in finance and economics, completing my education debt-free through a combination of scholarships, careful budgeting, and working multiple jobs throughout my college years. I own my home, a modest but charming craftsman bungalow in the Ballard neighborhood that I purchased 3 years ago after saving diligently for a down payment that allowed me to avoid private mortgage insurance and secure a favorable interest rate. My retirement accounts are fully funded according to recommended guidelines for my age and income level. I have an emergency fund that could sustain me for 8 months without employment. I have no credit card debt, no car payments, and no student loans. My credit score sits comfortably above 800. I achieved this financial stability not through inheritance or exceptional income, but through conscious choices about how I earn, save, and spend money. I pack my lunch for work rather than eating out daily. I buy quality clothing during end-of-season sales rather than paying full retail prices. I comparison shop for insurance, negotiate bills, and question whether purchases align with my values and long-term goals before committing to them. I have learned to distinguish between being cheap, which implies a reluctance to spend money even when spending is appropriate, and being frugal, which means being intentional and strategic about financial decisions in service of larger objectives. This distinction matters tremendously to me, but apparently it matters not at all to my older brother Derek, who had just accused me of being a cheapskate in front of our entire extended family at what was supposed to be a pleasant summer gathering to celebrate our parents' 35th wedding anniversary. The barbecue had been planned for weeks. Our mother had been excited about bringing the whole family together, something that happened less frequently as everyone's lives became more complicated with careers and relationships, and the general demands of adulthood. The invitation had specified casual attire and requested that everyone bring a side dish to share, which was typical for our family gatherings. I had spent the previous evening preparing a potato salad from scratch using a recipe I had perfected over years, the kind with red potatoes and a tangy mustard dressing that people always requested at potlucks. I had arrived on time, greeting relatives I had not seen in months, admiring my cousin's new baby, and asking my aunt about her recent trip to Portugal. The afternoon had unfolded pleasantly with the comfortable rhythms of family interaction, people clustering in small groups throughout my parents' large backyard, children running through the sprinkler, and the general hum of conversation and laughter that characterizes successful family events. Then Derek had approached me where I stood talking with our cousin Michelle about her graduate school applications. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, tall and broad-shouldered with the easy smile that had always made him popular in social situations. His wife Jennifer trailed slightly behind him, her expression suggesting she knew something uncomfortable was about to happen, and had already decided not to intervene. "Emma, we need to talk about Mom and Dad's gift," Derek had said without preamble, his tone already carrying an edge of confrontation that immediately put me on guard. I had known this conversation was coming. Several weeks earlier, Derek had sent a group text to me and our younger sister Olivia proposing that the three of us pool money to purchase an elaborate gift for our parents' anniversary. He had suggested a luxury cruise to Alaska, something our parents had mentioned wanting to do eventually but had never prioritized in their budget. Derek had researched options and found a 2-week cruise with extensive excursions that would cost approximately $9,000. His proposal was that we each contribute $3,000 to cover the full cost. I had responded to the text message privately rather than in the group chat, explaining to Derek that while I thought the cruise idea was lovely, I could not comfortably contribute $3,000 to a gift at this time. I was in the process of having some necessary foundation work done on my house, an unexpected expense that was consuming my discretionary funds for the next several months. I had suggested alternative gift ideas that would be meaningful but less expensive, or proposed that we each contribute what we could afford rather than setting a specific amount that might strain different family members' budgets differently. Derek had not responded well to my explanation. He had sent several follow-up messages suggesting that I could put the gift on a credit card and pay it off over time, that I was being selfish by not prioritizing our parents, and that if I managed my money better I would have funds available for important family occasions. I had tried to explain my philosophy about avoiding debt for discretionary purchases and living within my means, but Derek had dismissed these explanations as excuses. Eventually I had stopped responding to his messages, hoping the issue would be dropped, or that we could discuss it in person in a calmer moment. Instead, Derek had apparently decided that the family barbecue, surrounded by relatives and family friends, was the appropriate venue to pressure me about the gift contribution. "I told you I can't contribute $3,000 right now," I said quietly, trying to keep the conversation private despite Derek's volume. "I suggested some alternative ideas that I sent you last week." "Alternative ideas?" Derek repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You mean cheap alternatives that make us all look bad because you don't want to spend actual money on our parents?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. Around us, conversations had stopped. People were watching now, their attention drawn by Derek's aggressive tone and raised voice. I could see my mother near the grill, her expression worried as she registered the tension developing between her children. "That's not fair," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "I'm not refusing to contribute at all. I just can't afford $3,000 right now, and I don't think going into debt for a gift is financially responsible." "Right, because you're so financially responsible," Derek said, his tone mocking. "Living in your tiny house, driving your 10-year-old car, bringing potato salad in a Tupperware container instead of a nice serving dish. You're always pinching pennies and acting like you can't afford anything, but somehow you afford that fancy gym membership and your hiking trips." The accusations stung not because they were accurate but because they revealed how completely Derek misunderstood my financial philosophy and priorities. Yes, I had a gym membership because physical health was important to me and I had determined that the monthly cost was worth the value I received. Yes, I took hiking trips, but these were deliberately budget-conscious adventures where I camped rather than staying in hotels and prepared my own meals rather than eating at restaurants. These choices allowed me to pursue activities I valued while staying within my overall budget and continuing to make progress toward my financial goals. But explaining any of this in front of 40 relatives seemed impossible and inappropriate. I could feel the weight of their judgment, people making rapid calculations about whether Derek's characterization of me was accurate, whether I was indeed being unreasonably cheap about contributing to a gift for my own parents. "My financial choices are not up for public discussion," I said firmly, trying to establish a boundary that would end this conversation. "If you want to talk about the gift, we can do that privately." "Oh, so now you want privacy?" Derek said. "After you embarrassed me in front of Olivia by refusing to participate in a reasonable gift? After you made me look bad by being the only one who won't contribute?" This accusation revealed another layer to Derek's anger. Olivia, our younger sister, had apparently agreed to Derek's plan and committed to contributing $3,000. My refusal had disrupted the neat arrangement Derek had constructed, and now he was attempting to use public pressure to force my compliance. "I didn't embarrass you," I said, my own anger beginning to break through my attempts at diplomatic calm. "I privately explained that I couldn't afford the amount you proposed and suggested alternatives. You're the one who decided to make this a public issue." "Because you're being ridiculous," Derek shot back. "You make good money. You just refuse to spend it on anything meaningful. You're so busy hoarding your savings and obsessing over your budget spreadsheets that you can't even be generous to your own family. You're a cheapskate, Emma. Just admit it." The word hung in the air between us, sharp and cutting. Cheapskate. Not frugal, not financially responsible, not intentional about money. Cheapskate, with all its implications of selfishness and small-mindedness, and being unwilling to participate appropriately in normal social exchanges. I could see agreement in some of the faces watching us. My Uncle Tom, who had filed for bankruptcy twice and seemed to view my financial caution as implicit criticism of his own choices, nodded slightly as though Derek had articulated something he had been thinking. My cousin Bradley, who worked in sales and drove a luxury car he could barely afford, smirked in a way that suggested he found my humiliation entertaining. But I also saw other expressions. My Aunt Sarah, a widow who had learned financial independence after my uncle's death, looked troubled by Derek's attack. My cousin Michelle, the graduate student I had been talking with before this confrontation, seemed uncomfortable with the public nature of the conflict. And my mother was making her way across the yard toward us, her face set in the expression I recognized from childhood as meaning someone was about to be in serious trouble. "That's enough, Derek." My father's voice came from behind me, firm and brooking no argument. I had not heard him approach, but apparently he had been close enough to witness at least part of the confrontation. "This is not the time or place for this discussion." Derek's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face as he calculated whether to continue his attack now that our father had intervened. Jennifer touched his arm, murmuring something I could not hear, and he took a small step backward. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Derek said, his voice slightly less aggressive but still defiant. "Emma needs to stop being so tight with money and actually contribute to family events like a normal person." "I said that's enough," my father repeated, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Emma, why don't you help your mother in the kitchen for a few minutes?" It was not really a suggestion, and I recognized it for what it was. An exit, a way to remove me from the situation before it escalated further. Part of me wanted to refuse, to stand my ground and defend myself against Derek's accusations in front of everyone who had witnessed them. But a larger part of me just wanted to escape the weight of all those watching eyes, the suffocating feeling of being judged and found wanting based on a characterization that felt profoundly unfair. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I set down my plate and walked toward the house, feeling the eyes following me, hearing the immediate eruption of conversation that I knew was about the confrontation they had just witnessed. People would be taking sides, offering opinions, constructing narratives about the conflict based on their own financial values and their relationships with Derek and me. My mother met me at the back door, her face tight with suppressed emotion. She ushered me into the kitchen and closed the door behind us, muffling the sounds of the party continuing in the backyard. "Emma, honey, what was that about?" she asked, her voice gentle but clearly wanting answers. I felt tears threatening and fought them back. I would not cry. I would not give Derek the satisfaction of reducing me to tears over his baseless accusations and public humiliation. "Derek wanted me to contribute $3,000 to a cruise for you and Dad," I explained, my voice shaking slightly despite my efforts to control it. "I told him I couldn't afford that much right now because of the foundation work on my house. He decided to make it a public issue and call me cheap in front of everyone." My mother closed her eyes briefly, a gesture I recognized as her processing frustration. "He told me about the cruise idea," she said carefully. "I told him it was too extravagant, and that you kids shouldn't spend that kind of money on us. He said Olivia had already agreed and that he would convince you to participate." "Well, he tried to convince me by humiliating me," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "In front of the entire family." "I'm going to talk to him," my mother said, her tone suggesting that conversation would not be pleasant for Derek. "It won't matter," I said tiredly. "Everyone out there heard him. They all heard him call me a cheapskate and imply that I'm selfish and don't care about family. Even if you defend me, they'll think there's some truth to what he said." My mother reached out and took my hand, squeezing it firmly. "Emma, anyone who knows you knows that you're one of the most generous people in this family. You're always helping people, always showing up when someone needs support. The fact that you're careful with money doesn't make you cheap. It makes you smart." Her words were meant to comfort, but they could not erase the reality of what had just happened. Derek had publicly attacked my character in front of our entire family, And whether his accusations were fair or accurate mattered less than the fact that he had planted seeds of doubt about my generosity and my priorities. Some people would believe him simply because his version of the story aligned with their own values about money and spending. Others would believe him because he had spoken with such conviction and authority. I thought about the careful financial decisions I had made over the years, the sacrifices and trade-offs that had allowed me to build security and stability. I had lived with roommates longer than I wanted to in order to save for a house down payment. I had driven a reliable but unsexy car while friends upgraded to luxury vehicles. I had brought lunch to work for years while colleagues spent $15 daily on takeout. I had chosen free hiking adventures over expensive resort vacations. Every one of these choices had been intentional, made in service of long-term goals that mattered to me more than short-term gratification or social approval. But Derek had reduced all of those intentional choices to a single ugly word: cheapskate. And he had done it publicly, in front of people whose opinions mattered to me, at an event that was supposed to celebrate family and connection. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from my best friend Rachel, who was not at the barbecue but who apparently had already heard about what happened through the mysterious network of family communication that seemed to operate at the speed of light. Just heard about Derek's performance. Are you okay? Want me to come get you? I stared at the message, touched by Rachel's immediate offer of support and rescue. But leaving felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that Derek's attack had landed effectively enough to drive me away from my own family gathering. I'm okay, I typed back, though I was not sure that was true. Thanks for checking on me. My mother was watching me with concern. Do you want to leave? She asked quietly. I would completely understand if you did. The offer was tempting. I could slip out the back door, avoid returning to the backyard full of relatives who were probably still discussing the confrontation, and escape to the privacy of my own home where I would not have to face anyone's judgment or questions. But leaving would also mean letting Derek win, allowing him to drive me away from a family event through his aggressive tactics and public shaming. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to go back out there and defend myself. Part of me wants to leave and never speak to Derek again. And part of me just wants to hide in here until everyone forgets about it. None of those options sound particularly appealing, my mother observed gently. She was right. There was no good option here. No choice that would resolve the situation cleanly or restore the pleasant family gathering that had existed before Derek's attack. Whatever I did next would have consequences that extended beyond this single afternoon, affecting my relationships with family members and the dynamics at future gatherings. Through the kitchen window, I could see people still clustered in the backyard. Some were eating, some were talking, and some were glancing toward the house with expressions that suggested they were curious about what was happening inside. Derek stood near the grill with Jennifer and Olivia, his body language suggesting he was holding court, probably defending his behavior and further explaining why I deserved the public call-out he had delivered. I felt something hardening inside me, a crystallization of resolve that surprised me with its sudden clarity. Derek had chosen to make this confrontation public. He had decided to attack my character in front of our family, rather than having a private conversation about a genuine disagreement. He had weaponized social pressure and public humiliation in an attempt to force me into financial decisions that I had already explained I could not comfortably make. And I realized, standing in my parents' kitchen with my mother watching me with worried eyes, that this moment was about much more than a disagreement about a gift or conflicting philosophies about money. This was about respect and boundaries and whether I would allow myself to be bullied into compliance through public shaming and social pressure. I think I am going to leave, I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. Not because Derek drove me away, but because I need some time to think about what just happened and what it means for how I engage with family events going forward. My mother nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her expression. I think that's wise, she said quietly. And Emma? For what it's worth, I'm proud of how you handled yourself out there. A lot of people would have struck back or caused a scene. You kept your dignity even when Derek was trying to take it from you. Her words brought the tears I had been fighting, and I blinked them back furiously. It doesn't feel very dignified to be called a cheapskate in front of 40 relatives, I said, my voice thick with suppressed emotion. No, my mother agreed. But how Derek chose to behave reflects on him, not on you. Anyone paying attention could see that. I was not sure I believed that, but I appreciated her saying it. I hugged her briefly, gathered my purse from where I had left it near the front door, and slipped out of the house without returning to the backyard. As I walked to my car, I could hear the sounds of the party continuing behind me, life going on as though nothing significant had happened. But something significant had happened. My brother had publicly humiliated me, attacked my character, and tried to shame me into making financial decisions that violated my own values and boundaries. And I had walked away rather than defending myself or demanding the apology I deserved. The question now was what I would do next. The drive home from my parents' house passed in a blur of fractured thoughts and suppressed emotion. I navigated the familiar streets of Seattle on autopilot, my conscious mind occupied with replaying the confrontation in the backyard, examining each moment for what I could have said differently, what response might have salvaged the situation or at least preserved some measure of dignity in front of witnesses who now carried their own interpretations of what had transpired. The rational part of my brain recognized that leaving had been the mature choice, that engaging further with Derek's aggression would have accomplished nothing except escalating the conflict and providing additional entertainment for relatives who seemed to enjoy family drama as much as they enjoyed my mother's famous barbecue ribs. But another part of me, a part one was not particularly proud of but could not deny, felt the sting of retreat, the uncomfortable sensation of having been driven from a family gathering by someone who had no right to make demands about my financial decisions or pass judgment on choices that were none of his concern. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the front yard that I had spent the previous weekend weeding and mulching. My small craftsman bungalow looked welcoming and peaceful, exactly the sanctuary I needed after the turbulence of the barbecue, but I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside, unwilling to carry the weight of what had happened into the space I had worked so hard to make my own. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the drive, notifications accumulating in a way that suggested multiple people were attempting to contact me. I had ignored them all while driving, but now, sitting in my driveway with the engine off and silence pressing in around me, I reluctantly pulled out my phone to assess the damage. 17 text messages, 9 missed calls, 3 voicemails. The digital evidence of a family crisis in full bloom. Everyone wanting to offer their perspective or extract information they could use in their own conversations about the incident. The first message was from Olivia, my younger sister, sent approximately 15 minutes after I had left the party. Her text carried the slightly defensive tone she often adopted when trying to navigate between Derek's aggressive certainty and my quieter resistance to family pressure. Emma, where did you go? Derek said you stormed off because you were embarrassed. Is that true? I think you're overreacting about the gift. It's for Mom and Dad. Can't you just put aside your budget obsession for once? I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling a fresh wave of frustration wash over me. Derek had apparently wasted no time in constructing a narrative that portrayed my departure as emotional overreaction, rather than reasonable response to public humiliation. And Olivia, who had witnessed the entire confrontation, had apparently chosen to accept Derek's version of events, rather than questioning whether his behavior might have been inappropriate. The characterization of my financial intentionality as a budget obsession particularly stung because it revealed how thoroughly my siblings misunderstood the principles that guided my relationship with money. I was not obsessed with budgeting in some pathological way that prevented me from enjoying life or participating in meaningful experiences. I was simply deliberate about ensuring that my spending aligned with my values and supported my long-term goals, rather than undermining them through impulsive decisions or social pressure. But explaining this distinction to Olivia through text messages felt futile. She had already decided that Derek's perspective was valid, that my refusal to contribute $3,000 to a gift constituted selfishness rather than reasonable boundary setting based on my current financial circumstances and my philosophical objection to going into debt for discretionary purchases. I scrolled past Olivia's message without responding and examined the others. 3 were from cousins who had been at the barbecue, each offering some variation of concern mixed with curiosity about the confrontation they had witnessed. 2 were from my Aunt Sarah, the widow who had rebuilt her financial life after my uncle's death, and who had always seemed to understand my approach to money better than most of my family members. Emma, I saw what happened with Derek. That was completely out of line. Are you okay? Call me if you want to talk. The second message from Aunt Sarah had arrived an hour later. I told Derek his behavior was inappropriate and that he owes you an apology. He didn't respond well to that feedback, but I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with how he handled things. These messages brought unexpected tears to my eyes, the kindness and validation they offered breaking through the defensive wall I had constructed during the drive home. Aunt Sarah understood. She recognized that Derek's public attack had been inappropriate regardless of the underlying disagreement about the gift. Her willingness to confront Derek on my behalf meant more than she probably realized. I typed out a response to her messages. Thank you, Aunt Sarah. I really appreciate you saying something. I'm okay just processing everything. Can we talk tomorrow? I think I need some time to figure out how to handle this. Her reply came almost immediately. Of course, sweetheart. Call me whenever you're ready. And for what it's worth, I think you handled yourself with remarkable grace under very difficult circumstances. Your uncle would have been proud of you. The reference to my late uncle, who had managed money carefully throughout his life and left Aunt Sarah with financial security that allowed her to weather his death without immediate crisis, felt particularly meaningful. He had understood the value of living within your means, of making intentional choices rather than following the crowd, of building stability that could support you through unexpected challenges. Aunt Sarah knew that my financial philosophy came from similar values, that it reflected thoughtfulness rather than stinginess. The remaining messages were more mixed. My cousin Bradley had sent a laughing emoji followed by, "Derek really called you out in front of everyone. That was brutal." The gleeful tone suggested he had found my humiliation entertaining rather than concerning, which told me everything I needed to know about his character, and how much weight I should give his opinions about anything. My mother had texted 3 times, increasingly worried messages asking if I was okay, and whether I had made it home safely. I responded to those immediately, not wanting her to worry unnecessarily about my physical safety even though my emotional state remained decidedly unsettled. I'm home. I'm okay. Just need some time alone to think. Thank you for being understanding. Her response came quickly. I love you, Emma. What Derek did was wrong, and your father and I will be addressing it with him. You don't deserve to be treated that way. I appreciated the sentiment, though I doubted any conversation my parents had with Derek would result in genuine understanding or meaningful change in his behavior. Derek had always been confident in his own perspectives, certain that his way of approaching life was the right way, and that anyone who made different choices was either misguided or deliberately difficult. Our parents had never been particularly effective at challenging that certainty or helping him develop empathy for viewpoints that differed from his own. The voicemails were more of the same. Olivia's voice message oscillated between concern and frustration, clearly torn between loyalty to her siblings and uncertainty about who was actually in the wrong. A cousin I barely knew had left a rambling message that seemed primarily designed to gather information she could share with other relatives. And Rachel, my best friend who had already texted earlier, had called to offer more detailed support and the promise of wine and commiseration whenever I was ready. I finally went inside my house, dropping my purse and keys on the small table near the front door, and standing for a moment in the quiet of my own space. The silence felt heavy after the noise and chaos of the barbecue, but it was also deeply comforting. Here, in this house I had purchased through careful saving and deliberate choices, nobody was judging my financial decisions or demanding that I justify my values. Here, I could simply exist without performance or explanation. My living room reflected the same intentionality that guided my financial life. The furniture was quality pieces I had acquired gradually, some purchased new during sales and others found through estate sales and refurbished with care. The bookshelves were full of volumes I had actually read rather than decorative displays designed to impress visitors. The artwork on the walls came from local artists whose work I genuinely loved, rather than expensive pieces purchased for status. Everything in this space had been chosen deliberately, acquired in ways that honored both my budget and my aesthetic preferences. This was the life Derek had mocked. This careful, intentional existence that allowed me to live debt-free, build wealth steadily, and make choices based on my own values rather than external pressure. He saw it as deprivation and stinginess when it was actually freedom and alignment between my resources and my priorities. I changed out of the sundress I had worn to the barbecue and into comfortable clothes, then made myself tea and settled onto my couch with my laptop, For years, I had maintained a private journal where I processed complicated emotions and situations, writing through confusion until clarity emerged. Tonight felt like an appropriate time to engage in that practice. I opened a new document and began typing, not editing or censoring my thoughts but simply allowing them to flow onto the screen in whatever form they took. The anger came first, hot and sharp, directed at Derek for his public attack and his complete lack of consideration for how his words would affect me. Then came frustration with Olivia for so quickly accepting Derek's narrative and joining him in characterizing my reasonable boundaries as overreaction. Disappointment in the relatives who had watched the confrontation with apparent entertainment rather than concern. Hurt that my own family could witness me being humiliated and fail to recognize how inappropriate Derek's behavior had been. But as I continued writing, other feelings emerged beneath the anger and hurt. There was a strange sense of clarity, a recognition that this confrontation had revealed truths about my family dynamics that I had been avoiding for years. This was not the first time Derek had dismissed my choices or belittled my approach to life. It was simply the first time he had done so with such public aggression, and in front of so many witnesses that I could no longer rationalize or minimize what was happening. Derek had always been the golden child, the one who did everything in ways that aligned with our parents' expectations and our extended family's values. He had married young to a woman who fit seamlessly into family gatherings. He had purchased a large house in a prestigious neighborhood, even though I suspected he was stretching his budget dangerously thin to maintain that lifestyle. He drove a luxury SUV, took expensive vacations, and posted extensively on social media about his acquisitions and experiences. Our parents praised his success and his ability to provide well for his family, never questioning whether the foundation beneath that impressive exterior was actually stable. I, by contrast, had always been slightly outside the approved narrative. I had focused on education and career development rather than rushing into marriage. I had chosen financial stability over impressive displays of wealth. I had bought a modest house I could truly afford rather than stretching for something that would impress neighbors. I drove a reliable but unglamorous car, took budget-conscious vacations, and rarely posted on social media about my life because I was too busy actually living it to document it constantly for external validation. These differences had created subtle tension for years, moments when family members made comments about my choices or asked questions that carried implications about whether I was really succeeding in life. But I had brushed off these moments, telling myself that I was secure enough in my own values that other people's opinions did not matter. I had convinced myself that my family's failure to understand my approach to life was not really a problem, because I did not need their understanding or approval. Tonight had shattered that comfortable fiction. Derek's public attack had forced me to confront the reality that my family did not just misunderstand my choices. They actively judged them, saw them as evidence of character flaws rather than different priorities, and felt entitled to pressure me into conforming to their expectations regardless of my own values or circumstances. The gift controversy was not really about whether I could afford to contribute $3,000. It was about whether I was willing to prioritize maintaining family approval over honoring my own financial principles and boundaries. Derek had attempted to use public humiliation as a tool to force my compliance, betting that the discomfort of being called a cheapskate in front of 40 relatives would be greater than my commitment to living according to my own values. And the question I now faced, sitting in my quiet living room with tea growing cold beside me and my journal entry stretching across multiple pages, was what I intended to do about that revelation. I could attempt to smooth things over, have a conversation with Derek where I tried once again to explain my perspective and hoped he would finally understand. I could contribute some amount to the gift even though it violated my principles, demonstrating that I was willing to compromise for the sake of family harmony. I could simply avoid future family gatherings where financial expectations might arise, protecting myself through distance rather than through direct confrontation of the underlying dynamics. Or I could acknowledge that this moment represented a crossroads, an opportunity to establish different terms for how I engaged with family members who felt entitled to judge my life choices and pressure me into decisions that did not serve my own interests. My phone buzzed with another incoming message. This time it was from Derek himself, sent nearly 3 hours after the confrontation at the barbecue. I don't appreciate you making me look bad by leaving the party. Mom and Dad are upset, and Olivia is caught in the middle because you can't handle honest feedback about your behavior. If you had just agreed to contribute to the gift like a normal person instead of being so rigid about your precious budget, none of this would have happened. You need to grow up and stop being so selfish. I read the message 3 times, my anger building with each reading. Derek had publicly humiliated me, attacked my character in front of our entire family, and attempted to shame me into making financial decisions that I had clearly communicated I could not comfortably make. And now he was blaming me for the consequences of his own behavior, framing my departure as the problem rather than acknowledging that his aggressive confrontation had created an impossible situation. The complete lack of self-awareness was almost impressive. Derek genuinely could not see that his actions had been inappropriate. He viewed the entire situation through a lens that cast himself as the reasonable party trying to coordinate a nice gift, while his difficult sister created problems through her stubbornness and oversensitivity. He had constructed a narrative that absolved him of any responsibility for the conflict and placed all blame on my shoulders for refusing to comply with his demands. For a long moment I considered how to respond. The urge to defend myself was powerful, to craft a message that would explain point by point exactly why his characterization was wrong, and why his behavior had been unacceptable. But as I sat there with my fingers hovering over the phone's keyboard, I realized that any response would be futile. Derek was not interested in understanding my perspective or acknowledging his role in creating the conflict. He wanted me to apologize, to admit I had been wrong, and to agree to contribute the money he had decided I should give. No response I could craft would change his mind or lead to productive dialogue. Engaging with his message would only provide him with additional opportunities to attack my choices and pressure me into compliance. The only way to win this particular game was to refuse to play it. I set my phone down without responding and returned to my journal entry, documenting Derek's message and my decision not to engage with it. The act of writing helped clarify my thinking, transforming the chaotic swirl of emotions into something more structured and manageable. As evening deepened into night, I found myself thinking about the concept of financial values and how they intersect with family dynamics and personal identity. Money is never really just about money. It represents security, freedom, status, power, and a host of other intangible things that vary tremendously from person to person based on their experiences, their fears, their aspirations, and their fundamental beliefs about how life should be lived. For Derek, money seemed to represent success and status, a tool for demonstrating that he had achieved the markers of adult accomplishment and could provide impressively for his family. Spending money publicly on visible things that others could observe and admire appeared to be how he validated his worth and position within social hierarchies. The idea of intentionally spending less than you could afford, of choosing modest options when more expensive ones were available, probably felt to him like voluntarily accepting inferior status when superior status was within reach. For me, money represented freedom and security, the foundation that allowed me to make choices based on my authentic preferences rather than external pressure. Having savings meant I could weather unexpected challenges without crisis. Living below my means meant I was not trapped in jobs or relationships by financial dependence. Building wealth steadily meant I was creating options for my future self, ensuring that I would have choices available, rather than being forced into whatever circumstances my lack of resources dictated. These different relationships with money were not right or wrong in some absolute sense. They were simply different, reflecting different priorities and different visions of what constituted a life well lived. The problem arose when one person's financial values were treated as the only legitimate approach, and when different values were characterized as moral failings, rather than alternative perspectives. Derek saw my frugality as cheapness because he could not imagine that someone might voluntarily choose to spend less when they had the resources to spend more. The idea that I might actually prefer my modest house and reliable car and budget-conscious lifestyle was apparently incomprehensible to him. In his worldview, everyone wanted what he wanted, and anyone who claimed otherwise was either lying or deluding themselves. This fundamental failure of imagination, this inability to recognize that other people might genuinely hold different values and make different choices in service of those values, was at the heart of the conflict that had erupted at the barbecue. Derek had not attacked me because I had done something objectively wrong. He had attacked me because my choices implicitly challenged the universality of his own values, suggesting that his way of approaching life was not the only valid path. As I reflected on these dynamics, I realized that the gift controversy was symptomatic of much larger patterns in my family relationships. This was not really about whether I contributed $3,000 to an anniversary cruise. It was about whether I was willing to subordinate my own values and boundaries to maintain family harmony, whether I would accept being diminished and dismissed rather than risking conflict, whether I would continue to accommodate treatment that communicated my perspectives and choices were less legitimate than those of family members whose approaches aligned more closely with familial norms. The barbecue confrontation had been a catalyst, forcing into visibility dynamics that had been operating beneath the surface for years. Derek's public attack had simply made undeniable what had previously been subtle enough to rationalize or dismiss. And now I had to decide how I wanted to respond to that new clarity. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Olivia. This one more worried than accusatory. Emma, please talk to me. Derek showed me the message he sent you, and I think you're both being stubborn about this. Can't we just figure out some compromise so everyone can move forward? This is supposed to be a happy time celebrating mom and dad, and instead everyone is fighting. Please don't let this turn into some huge family rift over money. The plea for compromise was predictable and understandable. Olivia had always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and encouraged everyone to get along. She was uncomfortable with the tension that had erupted at the barbecue and desperate to restore equilibrium, even if that meant pressuring me to accommodate Derek's demands rather than holding him accountable for his inappropriate behavior. But her message revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what was actually happening. This was not a conflict between two equally stubborn siblings who needed to compromise and meet in the middle. This was a situation where one person had behaved inappropriately, and the other person was declining to pretend that behavior was acceptable. There was no middle ground between Derek's position that he could publicly humiliate me into compliance and my position that I deserved to be treated with respect regardless of whether my choices aligned with his preferences. I thought about how to respond to Olivia, whether to try once again to explain why this situation was not actually about the money or about stubbornness. But I was exhausted from the emotional labor of the day, tired of defending myself and justifying my boundaries, and attempting to help people understand perspectives they seemed determined not to see. Instead, I sent a simple message. I'm not interested in compromising about being treated with respect. When Derek is ready to apologize for how he spoke to me at the barbecue, we can have a conversation about the gift. Until then, I need some space from family dynamics. I sent the message before I could second-guess it, before the lifelong habit of accommodation and peacekeeping could convince me to soften my position or offer reassurances that would minimize the seriousness of what had happened. Then I turned off my phone entirely, removing the temptation to check for responses or engage further with family members who seemed invested in resolving the situation in ways that did not require Derek to acknowledge his behavior. The silence that followed felt both liberating and lonely. I had set a clear boundary, stated explicitly what would be required for me to engage in further discussion about the gift or the broader family dynamics. But I had also created distance from family members whose approval and acceptance I had sought throughout my life, even when that seeking required me to minimize my own needs and preferences. As I finally climbed into bed that night, my mind continued to process the events of the day and their implications for my relationships moving forward. Sleep was elusive, interrupted by fragments of the confrontation replaying in my mind and imagined conversations where I said all the things I had not said in the moment. But beneath the anxiety and the hurt, there was also something solid and unmovable, a conviction that I had made the right choice in refusing to accommodate behavior that diminished my dignity and dismissed my autonomy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new decisions about how to navigate the aftermath of the barbecue. But tonight, I had taken the first step toward establishing different terms for how I allowed myself to be treated by family members whose love seemed to come with conditions I was no longer willing to meet. The morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that characterized Seattle in June, when the city hovered between the promise of summer and the lingering grip of spring's unpredictable weather patterns. I woke earlier than necessary, my sleep having been fragmented and unsatisfying, punctuated by dreams that mixed memories of the barbecue confrontation with anxious scenarios about future family gatherings where I would face judgment and exclusion for my refusal to comply with Derek's demands. The house felt unusually quiet as I moved through my morning routine, making coffee and preparing the overnight oats I had set up the previous week as part of my meal preparation habits. These small rituals of self-care and organization typically grounded me, providing structure and predictability that balanced the more chaotic aspects of my professional life. But this morning, they felt hollow mechanical actions performed without the usual sense of satisfaction that came from taking care of myself efficiently and intentionally. I had deliberately left my phone turned off since the previous evening, creating a barrier between myself and whatever family drama might have continued to unfold in my absence. The decision had allowed me a few hours of peace, but I knew I could not avoid reconnecting indefinitely. My work email was accessible through my phone, and I had client meetings scheduled for the coming week that required coordination and preparation. Eventually, I would have to turn the device back on and face whatever messages had accumulated during my period of digital silence. I delayed that moment for as long as possible, drinking my coffee slowly while watching the rain streak down the kitchen windows and considering what the day ahead might hold. It was Sunday, typically a day I devoted to household tasks, meal preparation for the week, and perhaps a hike if the weather cooperated. The normalcy of those activities felt both appealing and impossible given the emotional turbulence I was experiencing. How could I simply go about my usual routines when my relationship with my family had shifted so dramatically in the space of a single afternoon? Eventually, necessity overcame avoidance, and I retrieved my phone from where I had left it charging in the bedroom. The screen illuminated with a cascade of notifications, more than I had accumulated in the previous evening before shutting down. 23 new text messages, 14 missed calls, 6 voicemails. The digital evidence of a family in crisis, everyone wanting to contribute their perspective or extract information, or push their preferred resolution to the conflict that had erupted at the barbecue. I took a deep breath and began sorting through the messages systematically, starting with the most recent and working backward through time. The first message was from my mother, sent at 7:30 that morning, her early rising suggesting she had not slept well either. "Emma, sweetheart, please call me when you wake up. Your father and I spoke with Derek last night, and there are some things we need to discuss as a family. I understand you're hurt, but we need to find a way to move forward from this situation. Family is too important to let disagreements create permanent damage." The message carried my mother's characteristic blend of concern and conflict avoidance, her desire to restore harmony without necessarily addressing the underlying issues that had disrupted it. I could imagine the conversation she and my father had conducted with Derek, probably encouraging him to see things from my perspective while simultaneously suggesting that I should be more flexible about the gift contribution. My parents had always approached sibling conflicts this way, treating them as bilateral misunderstandings that required equal compromise from all parties, rather than situations where one person's behavior might be clearly inappropriate and require specific accountability. The next several messages were from Olivia, sent at various points throughout the previous evening and early morning. Her text tracked an evolution from confusion to frustration to something approaching understanding, though that understanding seemed to come more from her own reflection than from any conversation with Derek or our parents. "I've been thinking about what happened at the barbecue, and I'm starting to realize that maybe Derek was out of line with how he approached things. But Emma, you have to understand that he's under a lot of stress right now with his job in the new house, and sometimes stress makes people say things they don't mean. Derek told me that you've always been judgmental about his spending habits, and that this gift situation was just the final straw where he felt like he needed to call you out. Is that true? Have you been criticizing how he manages his money?" "Okay, I just talked to Aunt Sarah, and she said some things that are making me see this differently. She said that Derek had no right to call you out publicly regardless of the disagreement about the gift, and that you were within your rights to set boundaries about what you can afford. I guess I was so focused on trying to keep everyone happy that I didn't really think about whether Derek's behavior was actually okay. Emma, I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you at the barbecue. I should have said something when Derek started attacking you in front of everyone. I was caught off guard and I didn't know what to do, but that's not a good excuse. You deserved better from me." These messages from Olivia represented a shift I had not anticipated. A willingness to reconsider her initial reaction and acknowledge that the situation was more complex than a simple disagreement between equally stubborn siblings. The apology, while coming later than I might have hoped, suggested that Olivia was capable of growth and reflection in ways that Derek apparently was not. I felt some of the tension in my chest ease slightly, Grateful that at least one of my siblings could recognize that boundaries and respect mattered more than maintaining superficial family harmony. I scrolled further back through the messages and found several from Derek, each one more aggressive and defensive than the last. He had apparently spent the evening constructing elaborate justifications for his behavior, none of which included any acknowledgement that publicly humiliating me might have been inappropriate. I talked to Mom and Dad, and they agree that you're being unreasonable about the gift. They said they don't want an expensive cruise if it's going to cause all this family drama, which just proves that your stubbornness is ruining what should have been a nice gesture. Jennifer thinks you're jealous of our success, and that's why you're always so weird about money. She said you probably resent that we have a nicer house and can afford things you can't, so you act superior about your budgeting to make yourself feel better. This is exactly why you're still single at 29. Nobody wants to be with someone who's so rigid and controlling about everything. You need to learn how to be flexible and go with the flow instead of always insisting on doing things your way. The messages were clearly designed to hurt, to find vulnerable points and press on them, until I either capitulated to his demands or exploded in anger that would justify his characterization of me as overly emotional and unreasonable. The reference to my relationship status was particularly calculated, leveraging social expectations about marriage and partnership as weapons to diminish my sense of worth and make me question whether my choices were leading to the kind of life I actually wanted. But reading these attacks through the lens of the previous day's reflection, I could see them for what they were. Derek was not offering genuine criticism or concern. He was attempting to manipulate me through emotional abuse, trying to create enough pain and self-doubt that I would do anything to make it stop, including abandoning my boundaries and complying with his financial demands. The cruelty was intentional, strategic, designed to break down my resistance and restore his sense of control over the situation. I took screenshots of Derek's messages and saved them in a folder on my phone. I was not sure yet what I would do with this documentation, but some instinct told me it might be important to have a record of exactly what he had said and how he had chosen to communicate during this conflict. If family members later tried to minimize his behavior or suggest that I was overreacting to minor disagreements, I would have evidence of the actual content and tone of his attacks. The remaining messages were from various relatives, each offering their own interpretation of events and their suggestions for how I should respond. My Uncle Tom, the one who had nodded in agreement when Derek called me a cheapskate, had sent a message suggesting that I should apologize to Derek for embarrassing him by leaving the party. My cousin Bradley had forwarded a meme about cheapskates that he apparently found hilarious and relevant to my situation. Several other relatives had sent variations on the theme that family was more important than money, and that I should prioritize relationships over my rigid financial principles. But there were also messages of support that provided counterbalance to the criticism and pressure. Aunt Sarah had sent multiple texts checking on my well-being and offering to talk whenever I was ready. Two cousins I had not expected to hear from had reached out to say they thought Derek's behavior was inappropriate, and that they supported my decision to set boundaries. Even one of my father's brothers, who I had always perceived as fairly traditional in his views about family obligations, had sent a brief message saying that no one should be publicly shamed about their financial decisions and that Derek owed me an apology. These supportive messages reminded me that family was not monolithic in its views or expectations. While some members clearly sided with Derek or prioritized conflict avoidance over accountability, others recognized that respect and dignity mattered more than maintaining the appearance of perfect harmony. I was not as alone in my perspective as I had feared in the immediate aftermath of the barbecue confrontation. The voicemails contained more of the same themes, though hearing the actual voices added emotional layers that text messages could not convey. My mother sounded tired and worried, caught between her children and unsure how to restore peace without alienating anyone. Derek sounded angry and righteous, completely convinced of his own correctness and my unreasonableness. Olivia sounded confused and guilty, processing her own role in the conflict and trying to figure out how to move forward. But it was the voicemail from my father that surprised me most. He rarely left voicemails, preferring brief text messages or waiting for return calls, rather than recording his thoughts. His message had come late the previous night, probably after my mother had gone to bed and he had time to reflect privately on what had happened. "Emma, it's Dad. I know you're probably not in the mood to talk right now, and I understand that. I want you to know that I spoke with Derek, And I told him that his behavior at the barbecue was unacceptable. You deserved better than to be called out publicly like that, regardless of any disagreement about the gift. I also want you to know that your mother and I never asked for an expensive cruise, and we certainly don't want our anniversary to be the cause of conflict between our children. Derek made assumptions about what we wanted without checking with us first, and then he tried to pressure you into going along with plans you had already said you couldn't afford. That wasn't fair to you. I hope we can talk soon, but take whatever time you need. We love you. I listened to that message 3 times, each hearing revealing new layers of meaning in my father's careful words. He had done something I had not expected. He had clearly taken a side, acknowledging that Derek's behavior was wrong, and that I had been treated unfairly. This was not his usual approach to sibling conflicts, where he typically encouraged mutual understanding and compromise without identifying whose actions had been inappropriate. His explicit statement that Derek had been unacceptable represented a significant departure from his normal conflict management style. The message also revealed information I had suspected, but not confirmed. My parents had not asked for or expected an expensive cruise. Derek had conceived of this gift idea independently and then attempted to recruit Olivia and me to fund it, presenting it as though it were something our parents desperately wanted rather than acknowledging it as his own vision of appropriate celebration. This reframing of the entire situation cast Derek's aggressive pressure in an even more problematic light. He had not been advocating for our parents' wishes. He had been trying to force me to participate in his own expensive gesture, regardless of whether it aligned with what our parents actually wanted or what I could reasonably afford. I saved my father's voicemail and sat for a long moment processing what his message meant for how I understood the previous day's events. The conflict was even more manufactured than I had realized, built on Derek's assumptions and his determination to create a specific kind of celebration regardless of practical considerations or other people's preferences. My refusal to participate had disrupted his vision, and rather than adjusting his plans or accepting that not everyone could contribute equally, he had chosen to attack my character and attempt to shame me into compliance. The rain had intensified outside, the steady rhythm against the windows providing a soothing backdrop to my churning thoughts. I made more coffee and settled at my kitchen table with my laptop, opening a new document to organize my thoughts about how I wanted to proceed. The situation required careful consideration and strategic thinking, rather than reactive emotional responses. I began by articulating what I knew to be true about the situation, creating a foundation of facts that would not shift regardless of how family members tried to reframe events. Derek had publicly humiliated me at a family gathering. He had called me a cheapskate in front of 40 relatives. He had attempted to pressure me into contributing $3,000 to a gift I had already explained I could not afford. When I had left the party rather than continuing to engage with his aggression, he had blamed me for creating family drama and characterized my boundary setting as selfishness and overreaction. In the messages he had sent subsequently, he had escalated to personal attacks about my life choices and relationship status, deliberately trying to cause pain and self-doubt. These facts were not up for debate or reinterpretation. They had happened, witnessed by multiple people, documented in messages I had saved. Whatever narrative Derek or other family members tried to construct, these fundamental truths remained solid and unchangeable. Next, I articulated what I needed to happen before I would be willing to engage further with Derek or participate in family events where he would be present. I needed a genuine apology that acknowledged the specific ways his behavior had been inappropriate and hurtful. I needed him to take responsibility for his actions without qualifying that responsibility with explanations about stress or justifications about my supposed shortcomings. I needed him to demonstrate understanding that my financial choices were not subject to his approval or critique, and that I had every right to set boundaries about what I could afford regardless of whether those boundaries aligned with his preferences. These requirements were clear and reasonable, but I also recognized that Derek might never be willing or able to meet them. People who attack others publicly and then blame their targets for the resulting conflict rarely possess the self-awareness or humility necessary for genuine apology and behavior change. I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that Derek would continue to insist he had done nothing wrong, and that choosing to maintain my boundaries might mean accepting permanent changes in my relationship with him, and potentially with other family members who sided with his perspective. Finally, I considered what maintaining my boundaries would actually look like in practical terms. It meant declining to attend family events where Derek would be present until the situation was resolved in a way that felt safe and respectful. It meant refusing to engage with messages or conversations that attempted to pressure me into abandoning my position or accepting treatment I found unacceptable. It meant being willing to accept that some family members would judge me harshly for prioritizing my own dignity over family harmony, and finding peace with that judgment rather than contorting myself to avoid it. This clarity felt simultaneously empowering and frightening. I had spent my entire life as someone who showed up for family obligations, who maintained relationships even when they were difficult, who prioritized connection and harmony. Choosing to step back from that role, to say that my participation was conditional on being treated with respect, represented a fundamental shift in how I understood my place within family systems and what I was willing to accept in exchange for belonging. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. The screen displayed Rachel's name, my best friend who had been checking in regularly since learning about the barbecue incident. I answered immediately, grateful for the opportunity to talk with someone whose support was unconditional and whose perspective was not clouded by family loyalty or complicated dynamics. "Emma, thank God," Rachel said as soon as I answered. "I've been worried about you. How are you holding up?" The genuine concern in her voice brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "I'm okay," I managed, though my voice contradicted the words. "It's been a rough 24 hours. I can only imagine. Do you want to talk about it? Or do you need distraction?" This was what I loved about Rachel. She understood instinctively what kind of support to offer, reading my emotional state and adjusting her approach accordingly. "Talk about it, I think. I need to process everything out loud with someone who won't try to convince me I'm overreacting." "You're definitely not overreacting," Rachel said firmly. "What Derek did was completely out of line. But tell me what's been happening since you left the barbecue. Have you heard from your family?" I walked her through the messages and voicemails, the spectrum of responses ranging from supportive to critical to aggressively defensive. Rachel listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds of sympathy or outrage at particularly egregious messages. When I finished summarizing the situation, she was quiet for a moment before responding. "Okay, so here's what I'm hearing," she said carefully. "Derek publicly attacked you, and when you set boundaries in response, he escalated to personal attacks designed to make you feel bad enough about yourself that you'd cave to his demands. Some family members recognize that his behavior was inappropriate, but others are more invested in pressuring you to compromise for the sake of family peace than in holding Derek accountable for how he treated you. And now you're trying to figure out how to navigate all of this without sacrificing your self-respect or abandoning your financial principles. Does that sound accurate?" "Painfully accurate," I confirmed. "Then I think you already know what you need to do," Rachel said gently. "You need to maintain your boundaries, even though it's going to be uncomfortable, and even though some people are going to judge you for it. Because the alternative is teaching Derek and everyone else that they can treat you however they want as long as they apply enough pressure afterward." Her words crystallized something I had been circling around in my own thinking. This was not just about one conflict or one gift or one family gathering. This was about establishing patterns that would govern how I was treated in future interactions with family members who seemed to believe that my compliance was more important than my dignity. If I backed down now, if I accepted Derek's behavior and contributed to the gift despite my clearly stated boundaries, I would be communicating that public humiliation was an effective strategy for getting me to do what others wanted. "You're right," I said slowly. "But Rachel, what if this permanently damages my relationship with my family? What if they decide I'm too difficult and stop including me in things? Then they're telling you something really important about what they value," Rachel replied. "Emma, you're one of the kindest, most generous people I know. You show up for people. You help your friends move and bring soup when someone's sick and remember everyone's birthdays. The idea that you're selfish or cheap or difficult is absurd to anyone who actually knows you. If your family can't see that, if they're willing to cut you out because you won't accept being publicly humiliated, then maybe spending less time with them would actually be healthy for you." The suggestion that distance from my family might be healthy rather than tragic represented a perspective I had not fully considered. I had always assumed that family relationships were inherently valuable, and worth preserving regardless of their cost to my well-being. But Rachel was suggesting an alternative framework where the quality of relationships mattered more than the biological connection, where it was acceptable to limit contact with people who consistently made you feel diminished or disrespected, even when those people were related to you. "I'm terrified of being alone," I admitted quietly. "If I lose my family over this, what do I have left?" "You have friends who actually value you," Rachel said immediately. "You have a career you're good at and proud of. You have a home you love and financial security you've worked hard to build. You have hobbies and interests and a whole life that exists independent of your family's approval. Emma, you're not going to be alone. You're going to be free from people who make you feel bad about yourself for making responsible choices." We talked for another hour, Rachel helping me think through practical considerations about how to communicate my boundaries to family members and how to respond to various scenarios that might unfold in the coming days and weeks. By the time we ended the call, I felt more grounded and clear about my path forward, even though uncertainty and anxiety remained about how that path would actually unfold. I spent the rest of the day drafting careful responses to the messages I had received, taking time to consider my words, and ensure they communicated my position without inviting further debate or providing openings for manipulation. To my mother, I wrote that I appreciated her concern and loved her, but that I needed Derek to apologize for his behavior before I would be comfortable attending family events where he would be present. To Olivia, I thanked her for her evolving understanding and her apology, and told her I valued her willingness to reconsider her initial reaction. To Aunt Sarah and the other relatives who had offered support, I expressed gratitude for their kindness and validation. To Derek, I wrote nothing. He had made his position clear through his aggressive messages, and engaging further would serve no productive purpose. If he genuinely wanted to repair our relationship, he knew what was required. An apology, acknowledgement of his inappropriate behavior, respect for my boundaries and autonomy. Until those things materialized, silence was the most appropriate response. As evening approached and the rain finally cleared, leaving the city washed clean and glittering in unexpected sunshine, I felt something shift inside me. The anxiety and hurt had not disappeared, but they had been joined by something else. A quiet determination, a recognition that I deserved better than what I had been accepting, a willingness to prioritize my own well-being, even when that prioritization created discomfort for others. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be difficult conversations and awkward family gatherings and relatives who would judge my choices without understanding the context that informed them. But I was choosing to walk that difficult road rather than continuing down the familiar path of accommodation and diminishment. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting my own dignity and self-respect ahead of my family's comfort and expectations. And while that choice was frightening in its unfamiliarity, it also felt profoundly right in a way I had not anticipated. This was what it meant to honor yourself, to recognize your own worth independent of external validation, to refuse to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that required you to be less than you were. I was done being small, done accepting crumbs of respect and conditional belonging, done teaching people through my accommodation that my boundaries were negotiable and my dignity was dispensable. Whatever came next, I would face it standing firmly in my own truth, rather than contorting myself to avoid conflict or maintain the illusion of family harmony. The barbecue confrontation had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been clarifying, revealing dynamics that had operated beneath the surface for years, and forcing me to make choices I had been avoiding. And in that clarity, despite all the discomfort it brought, there was also the beginning of something like freedom. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that sometimes follows Seattle rain. The city washed clean and gleaming under a sky so blue it seemed almost implausible after days of gray. I woke before my alarm, my body apparently having adjusted to the heightened state of alertness that had characterized the previous 48 hours, and moved through my morning routine with the deliberate focus I typically reserved for important client presentations or complex financial analyses that required absolute precision. The decision to maintain my boundaries despite family pressure had brought a measure of peace over the weekend, but I knew that the real test would come in the days ahead as I navigated the practical implications of that choice. Family dynamics did not resolve themselves simply because one person decided to stop accommodating dysfunction. Other people had to respond to that decision, and those responses would determine whether relationships could evolve into healthier patterns, or whether they would fracture under the weight of conflicting expectations and incompatible values. I arrived at my office earlier than usual, wanting time to settle into my professional persona before engaging with clients or colleagues who might notice if I seemed distracted or emotionally unsettled. The wealth management firm where I worked occupied several floors of a downtown tower with spectacular views of Elliott Bay, and my desk sat near windows that overlooked the water and the Olympic Mountains beyond. On clear mornings like this one, the view served as a reminder of why I had chosen Seattle as my home, why I valued the life I had built here through careful planning and intentional choices. My assistant Marcus was already at his desk when I passed his office, sorting through mail and organizing the day's schedule with the meticulous attention to detail that made him invaluable in managing the complex logistics of client relationships and meeting coordination. He looked up as I approached and offered a smile that carried a hint of concern. "Good morning, Emma. You're here early. Everything okay?" Marcus had worked with me for 3 years, long enough to recognize when something was troubling me even when I attempted to maintain professional composure. We had developed the kind of working relationship that balanced appropriate boundaries with genuine mutual respect and care, and I had learned to appreciate his ability to offer support without prying or making assumptions about what kind of help might be needed. "Rough weekend," I admitted, seeing no point in pretending otherwise. "Family stuff. Nothing that will affect work. But I wanted some quiet time this morning to get centered before the day gets hectic." "Understood. Your calendar is relatively light today. Just the monthly review meeting with the Johnson account at 10, and a prospective client consultation at 2. I moved your one-on-one with Richard to Thursday to give you some breathing room." I felt a surge of gratitude for Marcus's thoughtfulness. Richard was my supervisor, and while our regular check-ins were generally productive and supportive, they also required a level of mental presence and strategic thinking that I was not certain I could muster today, while still processing the emotional aftermath of the barbecue incident. Having that meeting postponed would allow me additional time to ensure my personal turmoil did not bleed into professional interactions in ways that might undermine my effectiveness or reputation. "Thank you, Marcus. That was good thinking." I settled into my office and spent the first hour reviewing client portfolios and preparing for the morning meeting, allowing the familiar rhythms of financial analysis to ground me in competence and clarity. This was terrain I understood completely, where my knowledge and expertise were unquestioned, and where my recommendations carried weight, because they were based on demonstrable skill rather than subjective judgments about my life choices or character. The contrast with my family dynamics was stark and oddly comforting. The Johnson account meeting proceeded smoothly, the clients expressing satisfaction with recent portfolio performance, and asking thoughtful questions about rebalancing strategies, given current market conditions. I found myself relaxing into the professional interaction, grateful for the opportunity to focus on concrete problems with clear solutions, rather than the murky emotional complexity of family conflicts that resisted resolution through logic or expertise. During the lunch hour, I retreated to a small park near my office building, finding a bench where I could eat the salad I had prepared the previous evening, while watching office workers and tourists navigate the downtown streets. The solitude felt necessary, a buffer between the morning's professional demands and the afternoon consultation that would require fresh energy and presence. My phone had been relatively quiet throughout the morning, just a few work-related messages and one text from Rachel checking in on how I was managing the return to normal routines. But as I sat in the park eating my lunch, a new message appeared from Olivia, the timestamp indicating she had sent it during her own lunch break from the nonprofit, where she worked coordinating volunteer programs for underserved communities. "Emma, I wanted to give you a heads up that Derek is planning to reach out to you today. He talked to Mom and Dad yesterday, and they strongly encouraged him to apologize for how he handled things at the barbecue. I don't know exactly what he's going to say, but I thought you should be prepared. Also, I've been doing some thinking about the whole gift situation, and I realized that I agreed to contribute $3,000 without really considering whether that was a smart financial decision for me. I was so focused on pleasing Derek and seeming generous that I didn't think about the fact that I'm trying to save for a house down payment, and that putting this much money toward a gift would set back my own goals significantly. Watching you set boundaries made me realize I need to work on doing the same thing. Thank you for that example, even though I know it's been really hard for you." I read Olivia's message several times, absorbing both the warning about Derek's impending contact and the unexpected revelation about her own financial situation. My younger sister had always presented herself as having everything together, managing her career and her finances with apparent ease while also maintaining an active social life and various creative pursuits. The admission that she had committed to an expense she could not comfortably afford simply to avoid disappointing Derek suggested that I was not the only family member who struggled with setting boundaries and prioritizing personal needs over external expectations. The acknowledgement that my boundary setting had provided a helpful example carried particular significance. I had spent the weekend worrying that my refusal to accommodate Derek's demands would be perceived as selfishness or rigidity, that other family members would see my choices as evidence of character flaws, rather than legitimate self-advocacy. But Olivia was suggesting an alternative interpretation, one where my willingness to maintain boundaries despite pressure and criticism actually served as a model for healthier behavior that she wanted to emulate. I typed out a response carefully, wanting to offer support without inadvertently pressuring Olivia to take my side in family conflicts, or making her feel like she had to choose between loyalty to Derek and loyalty to me. Thank you for the warning about Derek. I appreciate you thinking of me, and I'm really glad my boundary setting has been helpful rather than just creating problems for everyone. It takes courage to recognize when we've committed to something that doesn't actually serve our own interests, and even more courage to reconsider those commitments. If you want to talk about the gift contribution or anything else related to finances and boundaries, I'm always here. I love you, Liv. The response came quickly, suggesting Olivia had been waiting to see how I would react to her message. I love you too. And yes, I'd like to talk more about this stuff when things settle down. I'm realizing I have a lot to learn about managing money in ways that align with my actual values rather than just doing what seems expected or impressive. I saved that message alongside the others I had been documenting throughout this situation, recognizing it as evidence that the conflict with Derek, however painful, was potentially catalyzing important conversations and self-reflection among family members who had previously accepted problematic dynamics without questioning them. Change was uncomfortable and often emerged through crisis rather than through calm, rational discussion, but that did not make the change less valuable or necessary. The afternoon client consultation required my full attention. A young couple seeking guidance on retirement planning and college savings strategies for their 2 young children. They were thoughtful and engaged, asking good questions and demonstrating the kind of long-term thinking that typically led to positive financial outcomes. I found myself energized by their genuine interest in building security for their family, the way they listened carefully to my recommendations and asked follow-up questions that indicated they were truly processing the information rather than just going through the motions of a consultation. As the meeting concluded and the couple scheduled a follow-up appointment to finalize their financial plan, the woman paused before leaving my office and looked at me with an expression I could not quite interpret. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said hesitantly. "You don't have to answer if it's inappropriate." I nodded, curious about what question had prompted this disclaimer. "How did you develop such a clear philosophy about money? I mean, you obviously know the technical side of financial planning, but you also seem to have this deeper understanding of how financial decisions connect to values and life goals. Was that something you learned? Or is it just natural for you?" The question surprised me, partly because it came from a client rather than a friend or colleague, and partly because it touched on themes I had been grappling with intensely over the weekend. I considered how to respond honestly without oversharing about personal situations that were not relevant to professional interactions. "I think it developed gradually," I said carefully. "Early in my career, I focused primarily on the technical aspects of financial analysis and investment strategies. But over time, I realized that the numbers only tell part of the story. The more important questions are about what kind of life you want to build, and how your financial decisions either support or undermine that vision. I had to do a lot of personal work to clarify my own values and then align my financial habits with those values, and that process taught me how to help clients do the same thing." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. I think a lot of people, including us, make financial decisions based on what seems normal or expected without really questioning whether those decisions reflect our actual priorities. It's refreshing to work with someone who asks those deeper questions." After the couple left, I sat in my office for a few minutes reflecting on that interaction and what it revealed about the relationship between financial decisions and identity. Money was never just about money. It was always about power and security and freedom and status and belonging and a dozen other intangible things that varied from person to person based on their histories and fears and aspirations. The conflict with Derek had ultimately been about these deeper issues rather than about the specific dollar amount he wanted me to contribute to a gift. Derek saw my frugality as evidence that I valued money over relationships, that I was willing to sacrifice family harmony for the sake of maintaining my budget and saving accounts. But from my perspective, my financial intentionality was precisely what allowed me to have healthy relationships, because it meant I was not trapped by dependence or resentment or the anxiety that comes from living beyond your means and feeling perpetually vulnerable to financial crisis. The security I had built through careful planning gave me the freedom to make choices based on my authentic preferences, rather than on desperation or social pressure. These competing understandings of what money meant and how it should be managed were not reconcilable through logic or persuasion. They reflected fundamentally different worldviews that had been shaped by different experiences and different temperaments. Derek would likely never understand why I prioritize financial stability over impressive displays of generosity, just as I would likely never understand why he was willing to stretch his budget to the breaking point in order to fund expensive gestures and maintain appearances of affluence. The realization brought a strange sense of peace. I had been operating under the assumption that if I could just explain my perspective clearly enough, if I could articulate my values and reasoning with sufficient precision, Derek would eventually understand and accept my choices even if he made different ones himself. But that assumption was based on a flawed premise, the idea that understanding would naturally lead to acceptance, and that conflicts arose primarily from miscommunication, rather than from genuine incompatibility of values and priorities. Derek understood my position perfectly well. He simply believed it was wrong, that his approach to money and generosity and family obligations was objectively superior to mine, and that my refusal to adopt his approach justified his aggressive attempts to pressure me into compliance. No amount of explanation would change that fundamental conviction, because it was rooted in identity and worldview rather than in factual misunderstanding that could be corrected through better communication. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, and I saw Derek's name on the screen. This was apparently the outreach that Olivia had warned me about, the apology that my parents had strongly encouraged him to offer. I took a deep breath and answered, moving to close my office door to ensure privacy for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. Emma. Derek's voice carried none of the warmth of familial affection, just a flatness that suggested he was making this call under duress, rather than from genuine desire to repair our relationship. Derek, Olivia mentioned you might be calling. Yeah, well, Mom and Dad seem to think I owe you an apology for what happened at the barbecue. The phrasing was telling, the suggestion that our parents believed he owed an apology rather than acknowledgement that he actually did owe one. And what do you think? I asked, keeping my voice neutral and declining to make this easy for him by accepting a perfunctory apology that lacked genuine remorse or understanding. There was a long pause before Derek responded, and I could almost hear him wrestling with whether to say what he actually thought or what he believed he was supposed to say to satisfy our parents and resolve the conflict with minimal personal accountability. I think I could have handled the situation more privately, he said finally. Mom pointed out that calling you out in front of everyone at the barbecue was probably not the best approach. So I'm sorry for the public nature of the conversation. But Emma, I still think you're being unreasonable about the gift, and I still think your obsession with your budget is getting in the way of you being able to participate normally in family events. The non-apology was almost impressive in its completeness. Derek had managed to acknowledge that the setting of his attack was inappropriate, while maintaining that the substance of his criticism was valid. He was sorry for embarrassing me publicly but not sorry for believing and expressing that I was cheap and selfish. He was willing to concede a tactical error in execution while refusing to question the underlying premise that my financial choices were subject to his judgment, and that his preferences should override my boundaries. That's not an apology, Derek, I said quietly. That's you saying you wish you had attacked my character in private, rather than in front of 40 relatives, while continuing to insist that attacking my character was justified. Oh, come on, Emma. Don't be so dramatic about this. I'm trying to meet you halfway here. Halfway between what? Halfway between respecting my boundaries and completely disregarding them? Halfway between treating me with dignity and publicly humiliating me? There's no middle ground on respect, Derek. Either you recognize that my financial decisions are my own business, and that I have every right to set boundaries about what I can afford, or you continue to believe you have the right to pressure me into compliance with your expectations. Those aren't positions that can be split down the middle. I could hear Derek's frustration building through the phone, the sound of someone who had expected a script to play out in a predictable way, and was discovering that the other party was declining to follow that script. Fine. What do you want from me? What would constitute an acceptable apology in your world? The question revealed more than Derek probably intended. He was not interested in understanding what genuine apology required or in examining his own behavior and its impact. He was interested in identifying the minimum performance necessary to resolve the conflict and restore normal family functioning, the specific words he needed to say to check a box and move past this inconvenient situation. I want you to acknowledge that what you said at the barbecue was inappropriate and hurtful, without qualifying that acknowledgement with explanations about why you felt justified in saying it, I said clearly. I want you to recognize that my financial choices are not subject to your approval or criticism, and that I have the right to set boundaries about what I will contribute to gifts or any other family expenses. I want you to understand that the messages you sent after the barbecue, attacking my relationship status and suggesting that my life choices make me unlovable, were cruel and manipulative. And I want you to commit to treating me with respect in future interactions, even when you disagree with my decisions. The silence that followed was heavy and prolonged, stretching out until I wondered if Derek had simply ended the call rather than responding to requirements he found unreasonable or impossible to meet. You're asking me to pretend I think your choices are fine when I don't, he said finally. You're asking me to lie about believing your budget obsession is healthy when I think it's actually really damaging to your relationships and your ability to connect with people. I'm not asking you to lie about your opinions, I clarified. I'm asking you to keep those opinions to yourself and treat me with basic respect regardless of whether you agree with how I live my life. You don't have to think my financial philosophy is correct. You just have to stop attacking me for having a different philosophy than yours. And if I can't do that? If I think staying silent about your issues would be enabling behavior that's ultimately harmful to you? The question hung between us, crystallizing the fundamental impasse that no amount of conversation would resolve. Derek genuinely believed he was helping me by criticizing my financial choices and pressuring me to adopt his approach. He saw his aggressive intervention as a form of tough love, necessary pushback against tendencies he viewed as unhealthy and self-defeating. The fact that I experienced his behavior as controlling and disrespectful was, from his perspective, evidence that I was too defensive to accept the feedback I needed. Then I guess we're at an impasse, I said quietly. Because I'm not willing to maintain a relationship where someone feels entitled to constantly judge and criticize my life choices under the guise of helping me. If you can't offer basic respect, then we don't have a foundation for meaningful relationship. So that's it? You're just going to cut me out of your life because I won't pretend everything you do is perfect? The reframing was predictable, reducing my boundary to an unreasonable demand for perfection, rather than acknowledging it as a request for basic dignity. Derek was skilled at this kind of rhetorical manipulation, taking legitimate concerns and twisting them into exaggerated positions that sounded absurd when stated baldly. I'm not cutting you out, Derek. I'm saying that my continued participation in family relationships is conditional on being treated with respect. If you choose to interpret that as an unreasonable demand, that's your prerogative. But I'm not going to pretend your behavior at the barbecue was acceptable, and I'm not going to expose myself to future similar treatment just to maintain the appearance of family harmony. Derek made a sound of disgust. This is exactly what Jennifer said would happen. She told me you'd turn this into some huge dramatic thing where you're the victim and I'm the villain, and you'd use it as an excuse to isolate yourself from the family because you can't handle anyone questioning your choices. The reference to his wife's interpretation of the situation revealed another layer of the dynamic. Jennifer had apparently been reinforcing Derek's perspective, confirming his belief that I was the problem rather than encouraging him to consider whether his behavior might have been inappropriate. They had constructed a shared narrative where my boundary setting was pathological rather than healthy, evidence of dysfunction, rather than appropriate self-advocacy. I need to get back to work, I said, no longer seeing any productive purpose in continuing the conversation. If you decide you're willing to offer a genuine apology and commit to respectful treatment, you know how to reach me. Until then, I think it's best if we have some distance. Emma, wait. Don't just hang up. We need to figure out what we're going to do about the gift situation. Mom and Dad's anniversary is in 3 weeks, and we still need to coordinate something. The presumption that I would still participate in gift planning after everything that had happened was almost breathtaking in its audacity. Derek had publicly humiliated me, sent cruel messages attacking my character, offered a non-apology that maintained I deserved criticism, while conceding only that the setting of that criticism was poorly chosen. And now he expected me to collaborate with him on the very gift that had sparked this entire conflict. I'll be handling my gift to Mom and Dad independently, I said firmly. Whatever you and Olivia decide to do is your business, but I won't be coordinating with you on this. That's going to look really bad, Emma. 3 separate gifts instead of one nice combined present. Mom and Dad are going to know we're fighting, and it's going to ruin their anniversary celebration. Then perhaps you should have considered that before you called me a cheapskate in front of 40 relatives, I replied, and ended the call before Derek could respond. I sat at my desk for several minutes afterward, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline that had flooded my system during the confrontation. The conversation had confirmed what I had suspected but hoped might not be true. Derek was not capable of the kind of reflection and accountability that would be necessary to repair our relationship. He was too invested in his own righteousness, too certain that his perspective was correct and mine was flawed, too committed to the narrative where I was the problem, and he was the frustrated family member trying to help me see my errors. The grief I felt was not for the loss of what had existed, but for the loss of what I had hoped might be possible if only we could communicate more effectively or understand each other better. But that hope had been based on illusion, the comforting fiction that all family conflicts could be resolved through sufficient effort and good faith engagement. Some conflicts were not resolvable because they stemmed from fundamentally incompatible values, and from power dynamics where one person believed they had the right to control or judge another person's choices. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel, as though she had somehow sensed that I needed support. "How's your day going? Thinking of you." I responded honestly. Just got off the phone with Derek. He called to offer an apology that wasn't actually an apology, and to tell me that my boundaries are unreasonable and damaging. So that went about as well as expected. "I'm sorry, Emma. That must have been really hard. Are you okay?" "I will be. It's clarifying, actually. I kept hoping that if I could just explain things clearly enough, he would understand. But he doesn't want to understand. He wants me to admit I'm wrong and change to match his expectations. And that's never going to happen." "No, it's not. And that's okay. You deserve relationships where you don't have to constantly defend your right to make your own choices. Want to grab dinner tonight? My treat. We can debrief and plot your next moves." The offer brought tears to my eyes, the simple kindness of someone showing up exactly when support was needed. "That sounds perfect. Thank you, Rachel." As I wrapped up my workday and prepared to leave the office, I thought about the difference between the family relationships I had been born into and the friendships I had chosen and cultivated over years of mutual support and genuine care. My family relationships came with obligations and expectations that had been established before I was old enough to consent to them, patterns that had calcified over decades and resisted change, even when they caused harm. My friendships, by contrast, were built on mutual respect and shared values, flexible enough to accommodate growth and honest enough to address problems when they arose. The revelation that chosen relationships could be healthier and more supportive than biological ones felt both liberating and melancholy. I had spent so much of my life believing that family was the most important category of relationship, the connections that mattered most, and deserved the greatest investment of time and emotional energy. But perhaps that belief had been keeping me stuck in dynamics that diminished me, preventing me from fully appreciating and prioritizing the relationships that actually nourished my well-being rather than draining it. Walking out of my office building into the clear evening air, I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. The conversation with Derek had been painful but clarifying. The path forward was clearer now, even though it meant accepting losses and changes I would not have chosen. I was learning to distinguish between the relationships worth fighting for and the ones that required me to abandon myself in order to maintain them. And for the first time in my adult life, I was choosing myself. The dinner with Rachel unfolded at a small Italian restaurant we had discovered years earlier. The kind of neighborhood establishment that prioritized quality ingredients and authentic preparation over trendy presentation or social media appeal. The atmosphere was warm and unpretentious, exactly the environment I needed after the emotional intensity of the conversation with Derek and the careful professional composure I had maintained throughout the workday despite the turmoil churning beneath the surface. Rachel had already secured a quiet corner table when I arrived, positioned away from the main dining area where we could talk freely without concern about being overheard by nearby diners. She stood to embrace me as I approached, the gesture communicating wordless support and understanding that loosened something tight in my chest that had been constricted since the barbecue confrontation 2 days earlier. We ordered wine and pasta, falling into the comfortable rhythm of a friendship that had weathered multiple life transitions and personal crises over the 7 years since we had met through a professional networking group for women in finance. Rachel worked as a financial analyst for a tech company, and we had bonded initially over shared frustrations about gender dynamics in male-dominated industries before discovering deeper compatibilities in values and temperament that had sustained the friendship long after the professional connection that sparked it had become secondary to genuine personal affection. After the server departed with our orders, Rachel leaned forward with the focused attention she brought to important conversations, her expression conveying both concern and readiness to engage with whatever processing I needed to do about the family situation that had dominated my weekend and continued to reverberate through my interactions with relatives who seemed determined to force resolution on terms that required me to abandon my boundaries. "Tell me about the phone call with Derek," she said simply, creating space for me to share as much or as little detail as felt necessary for making sense of what had happened. I walked her through the conversation systematically, recreating Derek's non-apology and his insistence that my boundaries were unreasonable demands that prevented him from offering the honest feedback he believed I needed to correct my misguided approach to financial management and family relationships. Rachel listened without interrupting, though I could see her jaw tighten with anger at certain points in my recounting, particularly when I described how Derek had characterized my boundary setting as dramatic victimhood designed to isolate myself from family because I could not handle anyone questioning my choices. When I finished summarizing the call, Rachel was quiet for a moment, visibly collecting her thoughts before responding in a way that would be helpful rather than simply venting her own frustration with Derek's behavior on my behalf. "The thing that strikes me most about what you're describing is how thoroughly Derek has inverted the power dynamics," she said carefully. "He attacked you publicly, sent cruel messages afterward, and offered a fake apology that maintained you deserved criticism, while grudgingly conceding that the setting was inappropriate. But somehow in his telling of this story, you're the one with the problem because you won't accept his treatment and move on as though nothing significant happened. He's positioned himself as the reasonable party trying to help you see your flaws, and he's framed your boundaries as unreasonable demands that prevent honest family communication." The analysis crystallized something I had been feeling but had not articulated clearly to myself. Derek had successfully constructed a narrative where the person setting boundaries was the aggressor, and the person violating those boundaries was the victim of unreasonable demands. By characterizing my refusal to accept disrespect as dramatic overreaction, he had avoided any accountability for his own behavior, while simultaneously casting doubt on my judgment and emotional stability. "That's exactly what's happening," I confirmed, feeling the validation of having my perception reflected back by someone whose analytical abilities I trusted. "And the worst part is that some family members are accepting his version of events without questioning whether it actually matches what they witnessed. My cousin Bradley seems to think the whole thing is hilarious. My Uncle Tom apparently believes I should apologize to Derek for embarrassing him by leaving the barbecue. Even Olivia initially took Derek's side before she started reconsidering her reaction." Rachel shook her head with evident frustration. "People believe these inverted narratives because accepting them is easier than confronting the uncomfortable reality that family members can behave badly, and that maintaining relationships sometimes requires holding people accountable, rather than pressuring victims to forgive and forget. It's cognitively simpler to believe that you're being oversensitive than to acknowledge that Derek's behavior was genuinely inappropriate, and that the family dynamics that enabled it might be unhealthy." Our food arrived, providing a natural pause in the conversation as we began eating, and allowing the intensity to dissipate slightly before diving back into analysis of family dynamics and boundary-setting strategies. The pasta was excellent, the kind of simple preparation that showcased quality ingredients rather than trying to impress through complexity, and I found myself grateful once again for Rachel's instinct to suggest this particular restaurant where comfort and substance took precedence over appearance and status. After several minutes of eating in companionable silence, Rachel returned to the thread we had been exploring, her tone shifting slightly from analysis of what had already happened to consideration of what should happen next. "Have you thought about what you actually want the outcome of this situation to be?" she asked. "Not what you think should happen or what would be easiest, but what would actually feel right and healthy for you moving forward." The question was harder to answer than it should have been, requiring me to distinguish between multiple competing desires and identify which ones reflected my authentic preferences versus which ones had been shaped by internalized expectations about family obligations and the primacy of maintaining relationships regardless of their cost to individual well-being. I want Derek to genuinely understand why his behavior was wrong, and to offer a real apology that doesn't include justifications about why I deserved criticism, I said slowly, working through my thoughts as I articulated them. I want my family to recognize that my financial choices are valid, even if they differ from what Derek or others would choose. I want to be able to attend family gatherings without anxiety about being judged or pressured into financial commitments I'm not comfortable making. I want relationships with my siblings and parents that feel supportive rather than conditional on conforming to expectations I never agreed to. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. Those all sound like reasonable desires. Now let me ask a harder question. How likely do you think it is that those desires will actually be fulfilled? Based on what you know about Derek and the broader family dynamics, do you genuinely believe he's capable of the kind of reflection and accountability that would be necessary for offering a real apology? Do you think the family is likely to shift from their current position to one where your choices are respected rather than criticized? The question forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding, preferring to maintain hope that genuine change was possible, if I could just find the right words or approach the situation with sufficient patience and clarity. But Rachel was asking me to set aside that hopeful narrative and assess the situation based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. Probably not, I admitted quietly. Derek has never demonstrated the kind of self-awareness that would allow him to recognize his behavior as problematic. He's always been completely confident in his own rightness about everything, and the family has always enabled that confidence by treating his opinions as authoritative and dismissing pushback as oversensitivity or inability to handle honest feedback. So if the outcomes you want are unlikely to materialize, what does that mean for how you move forward? Rachel asked gently, not pushing toward any particular answer but rather encouraging me to follow the logical implications of my own assessment. I set down my fork and considered the question seriously, allowing myself to think beyond the immediate discomfort of family conflict to imagine what my life might look like with different boundaries in place around relationships that had historically consumed considerable emotional energy without providing commensurate support or validation. It means I need to stop waiting for my family to change and instead focus on changing how I engage with them, I said slowly. It means accepting that Derek and I probably can't have a close relationship given his inability to respect my autonomy, and that I need to create distance to protect myself from his judgment and criticism. It means recognizing that family gatherings might not be events I can comfortably attend if they're going to involve pressure and conflict about my life choices. It means building my sense of belonging and community around relationships that actually nourish me rather than drain me. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with emotion that suggested my words had touched something significant for her as well. Emma, I'm so proud of you for getting to that realization. I know it's not easy to let go of the hope that family relationships can become what you need them to be. But continuing to invest in relationships that require you to diminish yourself is not sustainable, and it's not what you deserve. The validation brought unexpected tears, and I blinked them back while taking a long drink of wine to regain composure. Rachel's support had been consistent throughout this crisis, but hearing her explicitly affirm that prioritizing my well-being over family expectations was not selfish or wrong carried particular weight, given how thoroughly I had internalized messages about the primacy of family loyalty and the importance of maintaining those relationships regardless of personal cost. We finished our meal while discussing practical considerations about how to implement the boundaries I had identified as necessary. Rachel asked thoughtful questions about what limited contact with Derek might look like in practice, how I would handle holidays and family celebrations where his presence was expected, what I would say to relatives who might pressure me to reconcile or suggest that I was overreacting to a minor conflict that should be forgiven and forgotten. These logistical discussions help transform abstract principles about boundary setting into concrete strategies I could actually employ when faced with specific situations. I began to develop language for explaining my position to family members who might not understand it, simple, clear statements that communicated my boundaries without inviting debate or negotiation about their validity. I'm not comfortable attending events where Derek will be present until we've had a genuine conversation about respect and boundaries. That was one option, straightforward and non-negotiable without being hostile or dramatic. I appreciate your concern, but my financial decisions are not up for discussion or critique. That could address relatives who felt entitled to offer unsolicited opinions about my approach to money management. I love our family, but I also need to prioritize my own well-being, and right now that means taking some space from dynamics that have become unhealthy for me. That might work for conversations with parents or other relatives who struggled to understand why I was creating distance from family gatherings and traditions. Rachel helped me refine these statements, identifying places where my natural inclination toward explanation and justification might create openings for others to argue against my boundaries, or suggest that I was misunderstanding situations that they could help me see more clearly. She reminded me that boundaries did not require extensive justification, that no was a complete sentence even if it felt insufficient when confronted with family members who had been conditioned to expect accommodation and flexibility from me in all situations. As we left the restaurant and walked together toward where we had parked our cars several blocks away, the evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of salt water from the nearby sound, and the complex urban mixture of restaurant exhaust and blooming plants that characterize downtown Seattle in early summer. I felt more grounded than I had since the barbecue incident, the combination of good food, supportive friendship, and practical planning having restored some sense of agency and clarity about the path forward. "Thank you for tonight," I said as we reached Rachel's car. "I don't know what I would do without you. You'd figure it out because you're strong and capable and smart," Rachel replied with characteristic directness. "But I'm glad you don't have to figure it out alone. That's what friendship is for, Emma. Having people in your corner who see your worth and reflect it back to you when you're struggling to remember it yourself." After we parted, I drove home through streets that were beginning to empty as the workweek evening gave way to quieter residential rhythms, people settling into their homes and routines after the demands of professional life had been satisfied for another day. My phone sat silent in my purse, and I felt no compulsion to check whether additional family drama had erupted during the hours I had spent focused on dinner and conversation with Rachel rather than monitoring the situation with Derek and managing other people's reactions to my boundary setting. The house welcomed me with its familiar comfortable emptiness, space I had created and maintained according to my own preferences without needing to accommodate anyone else's aesthetic or functional requirements. I moved through the evening routine of changing into comfortable clothes, preparing tea, and settling onto the couch with a book I had been reading slowly over the previous weeks, savoring the luxury of uninterrupted time to engage with ideas and narratives that had nothing to do with my immediate circumstances. But concentration proved difficult despite my genuine interest in the book's subject matter, my mind continuing to process the implications of decisions I had made about family boundaries, and what those decisions meant for my identity and my understanding of where I belonged in the complex social networks that had shaped my life since childhood. I set the book aside and retrieved my journal, returning to the practice of writing through confusion and uncertainty that had served me well throughout this crisis. The act of putting thoughts into written words helped clarify what I was actually feeling beneath the surface emotions that had been most accessible during conversations with Rachel and in my own internal reflections. The dominant feeling, I realized as I wrote, was not anger or hurt or anxiety, though all of those emotions were certainly present. The dominant feeling was grief, mourning for the family relationships I had wanted but never actually had, for the acceptance and validation I had sought but would likely never receive, for the vision of belonging and connection that had motivated so much accommodation and self-diminishment over the years only to prove fundamentally incompatible with being authentic about my values and boundaries. This grief was complicated by recognition that what I was mourning had never truly existed except in my imagination and hope. The unconditional acceptance I wanted from my family had always been conditional, contingent on conforming to expectations and prioritizing harmony over honesty about my actual needs and preferences. The support I had sought had always come with strings attached, available only when I was willing to minimize my own perspective in favor of maintaining the family narrative about who we were and how we related to each other. Acknowledging this truth felt both devastating and strangely liberating. Devastating because it required letting go of hope that had sustained me through years of small disappointments and subtle dismissals, the hope that eventually my family would see me clearly and value what they saw. Liberating because it freed me from the exhausting work of trying to earn something that was never going to be offered regardless of how much I contorted myself to deserve it. The phone rang suddenly, interrupting my journaling and causing my heart to jump with anxiety about what new family crisis might be unfolding. But the caller identification showed my Aunt Sarah's name, and I answered with relief rather than dread, grateful for contact with one of the few family members who had demonstrated consistent support and understanding throughout the barbecue aftermath. "Emma dear, I hope I'm not calling too late." Aunt Sarah's voice was warm and familiar, carrying none of the judgment or pressure that had characterized communications from other relatives. "Not at all, Aunt Sarah. I was just doing some writing and thinking. It's good to hear from you. I wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Your mother mentioned that Derek called you today, and I gathered from her tone that the conversation didn't go particularly well." I appreciated that Aunt Sarah was straightforward about having discussed me with my mother rather than pretending this was simply a spontaneous check-in call. The transparency felt respectful, acknowledging that information was circulating through family networks, while also making clear that her concern was genuine rather than strategic information gathering, designed to report back to others about my emotional state and willingness to reconcile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.